boy, do I have a treat for you today. I actually just got done with the interview. It is amazing, and I am so thrilled to bring you our guest today. She's Dr. Lynyetta Willis. She is a psychologist and family empowerment coach. She helps frustrated families break unhelpful patterns and cross-generational cycles so they can move out of what she calls stable misery and into more joy. We will dig into what stable misery is, warriors, because I know I've spent periods of my life in stable misery. And she will help us today on the show, and she helps her clients and audiences learn to strengthen their parenting, partnership, and personal growth practices so they can create more harmony in their hearts and homes. I am thrilled and honored to bring you today's guest. Let's go. All right, warriors, and welcome to another show with me, Susie Pettit, your certified life and wellness coach. And as I said, I have a wonderfully fantastic guest today. Dr. Lynyetta Willis is here on the show today. Thank you for coming.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. I love your mission and everything. It's so great. So this is truly an honor.
Well, great. And I am excited to just introduce you to the listeners who've not heard of you and who have not heard of the amazing work you do. And it sounds, it's like who haven't heard of stable misery, like, let's get into it, you know. But warriors, we want to hear, because Lynyetta and I have both lived in stable misery. Yes. So as someone who loves human behavior, I love learning about why people are doing what they're doing. Could you tell us a little about your life and how you got to do what it is that you're now doing?
Absolutely. So if we go way, way back to when I was really, really young, I was raised in a family that traditionally, from generation to generation, we used what I like to call the 4 horsemen mindset for our parenting. And that is pain, blame, shame, and avoidance. So those were the 4 things that were often used. Now, I say that in no way to reverse shame my family. You know, it's just what everybody knew, you know, like spankings and threats and blaming and, you know, what happens in this house stays in this house, you know, the avoidance, all of that was just very commonplace. And growing up, I had a really powerful experience. I have a sister who's 20 years younger than I am. And when she was about 2 and I was about, I guess, 22 or something like that, I used one of the 4 horsemen on her. It was just, I was triggered, I reacted, and I was like the cool big sis, you know, and I still can see the look on her face. Like, she just looked so deflated and so hurt. And in that moment, I said, you know what? I'm going to retire these horsemen. Like, this is not okay. I don't want to do this with my kids. I don't want to bring this into my family.
Yeah.
And then I had kids.
You remember, sorry to interrupt you, do you remember what you said, or what, like, how you used the 4?
Yeah,
I 4 horsemen with marriage, but not, I hadn't thought of it with
parenting. Yes.
Did, yeah, until I heard of it through you.
Exactly. So what ended up happening was, I don't remember what she did, but I remember I turned to her and I said, I'm so angry at you, I could smack you right now.
Yeah.
And she was like, huh? Like, I had never laid a hand on her. I still have never laid a hand on her, you know, but it was one of those things where it was like, that was just the thing in my family, like, you know, threatening to hit or smack, or, I mean, that was just, I mean, I laugh not because it's funny, but, you know, just in general,
that's
like,
how it showed up.
Yeah, that's how it showed up. So when I heard it come out of my mouth, I was like, oh.
Yeah.
I really just do that. That didn't feel good. I didn't like that. And I went over and I apologized, gave her a hug. And so when I had kids, I realized it wasn't as easy as just saying, I'm never going to yell. I'm never going to do anything. I'm just going to be this Mary Poppins mom who's just practically perfect in every way, you know?
I know, I'm right there with you.
You know, and it was the same thing even in my marriage. Like, when I got triggered or I was exhausted, or, you know, it was really easy to just react or overreact towards my husband in ways that just didn't feel good and didn't help the connection between us. So I I always say that, when I realized I wanted to shift my behaviors, and also I had some trauma from when I was a young adult that I needed to heal from, because it was impacting my marriage, things of that nature. So I decided, or my relationships, I wasn't married yet. So I said, okay, I can either go into therapy and dig all deep into the emotional stuff, or I can go and get a master's degree and a PhD, and I can learn my way into healing. That's what I'm going to do.
Action oriented. Yeah, that's my kind of lady. And
Exactly. So like 10 years and $100,000 later, I realized that wasn't the silver bullet I was looking for either, right? Who knew? The stuff was still there, even though I was helping couples and I was helping parents, and I was
tell them what to do.
Exactly. That's really all it did. It just gave me the ability to tell everybody else what to do. But the little children, the inner children, were still lurking around in my basement, popping up whenever they had a chance. So that's when I turned and I said, okay, I'm in. And I started doing some deep healing work, some spiritual work, some emotional work. And what that brought me to was this realization that it requires more than books and parenting summits or marriage courses and all that stuff to really transform who we are as people, as partners, as parents. It really requires inner work. It's an inside job, essentially. And what I've done is I've pulled together, I really took I love creating things and seeing systems and how things work together. It just all sort of clicks for me. And so I sat down and I said, what are all the main components that I find are really helpful in transforming myself and my relationships and dealing with my triggers and things like that? And that's how the Release Yourself from Stable Misery Roadmap was born. And to go back to stable misery, that's a phrase. It's interesting. I've used that phrase for over 20 years.
Really?
I have.
Yeah.
But I was in a workshop and I mentioned it, and someone and everybody else in the workshop jumped all over it. They were like, wait, what was that? What was that? And I was like, wait, this resonates with you?
Do you? Yeah.
And so what it really is, it's that place that we find ourselves when, for the most part, things are going pretty well in our life, like we can't really complain. But when in certain relationships, usually in our marriages and in our parenting, we find ourselves repeating the same patterns again and again, and we just can't break free. So it's stable because it keeps happening, keeps going. It's not blowing up the house, but it's not, necessarily keeping it in order either, right? And we're miserable, right? And especially when it comes to those two relationships, especially partnerships and parenting, those are the two that, many of us when we were young, we would dream about that. Like, oh, I'm going to get married one day, I'm going to be so happy. And, oh, I'm going to have a baby one day and I'm going to be so happy, So it can even add to the misery when we realize, like, this parenting thing kind of sucks. Like, or this marriage thing is hard. Why do we keep doing this,
Oh, that's so, and that is so, I call it like the good enough life. Like it's sort of this like, oh, I should be happy. Like I have the husband and the kid and the dog or
right. Picket fence, all that stuff.
Come on. But then that almost just encourages that stable misery. What are some signs that you're in a stable misery relationship or marriage?
Yeah. So one of the biggest telltale signs is you go from soulmate to roommate, right? Like you have that space where you're like, oh, everything's great. And then all of a sudden you're just sort of passing each other by. And you might go a whole day and realize, like, we haven't had a substantive conversation, not about the kids, all day long. Yeah. Right? Or you find you.
I was like, I did that in my first marriage, like all month, like
all month. Yes, absolutely, yes. Yeah. You find yourself fighting about the same things over and over and over again. You just don't know why, and you try different things, and it just doesn't seem to work, and you can't figure out why you're doing it. Another sign might be that you find yourself repeating things from other dynamics from other relationships that you were in your marriage, right? So things are coming up in ways where you're like, wait a minute. This happened in my last relationship, the relationship before, right? So that's a sign that maybe you're dragging some of that old stuff into the new relationship. So it's really just that space of like, wait, something's not wrong. Anytime you start to feel on a consistent basis less than some semblance of joy or contentment or fulfillment, and you might be in a stable misery marriage. And the way it shows up in parenting, and a lot of times is very similar. Like you find it a lot of times with a lot of the parents I work with, they kind of get into this burnt out phase. Like parenting burnout is a thing, people. Like that is a thing, right? Or you find yourself reacting to your kids even though you realize they're just being kids. Like I hear that a lot from my clients. Like I know I can sit here right now and tell you that's developmentally appropriate. I know they're just being kids, but in the moment, I just flip out, you know, or you find yourself reacting to your kids like your caregivers reacted to you, even though you promised you never would.
Okay. Sort of like what you did with your sister.
Exactly. And you're doing it again and again.
And
right?
speak of how you look at your past to sort of help you. Could you speak a little more about how it can actually help you? Because I know sometimes we look at the past and we're like, well, that's how it is. So
Absolutely. I am really big on what I like to call legacy tree blessings and legacy tree burdens. Yes. And I say, you know, we come into this life, we come in with a tree. I know it doesn't seem that way. It seems like it's a baby and placenta and that's it. But we often miss the big tree that comes out after us and after all that. And it has two types of fruit. It has legacy blessings and legacy burdens. And what often happens is ideally, what we want to do is we want to sort of prune the burdens and we want to care for and nurture the blessings, but we have to be aware of them, right? So sitting down and really just reflecting on what are things that I experienced growing up that I don't want to pass on to my kids. What are things that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be behaviors, right? It could be, or not behaviors like parenting behaviors. It could be health things like high blood pressure runs rampant throughout my family. That is absolutely a legacy burden. And it's just something, this is the other thing about legacy burdens, kind of like you alluded to a minute ago, they just become accepted as the way things are.
The way it is, yeah.
Yes, this is how it is. My mom was, my mom's mom, and you know, and all this stuff.
Sure, we're yellers, or you know, it's settling into that behavier, right?
Exactly. Or divorce, you know, that could be a burden. Like you look back and you're like, wow, that's like all the women in my family. I mean, that's not necessarily the case in my family, but like my mom and dad were divorced, you know, my dad left when I was really young, you know, and so that's something that could easily become a burden in my lineage, very, very easily. So really looking back and saying, what are things that I am not going to repeat? Like I rebuke high blood pressure every step. Like I actually have high blood pressure.
Yeah.
I do, you know, and it's one of those things where I'm like, I refuse to pass this on to my children. Like, I don't want to hear about genetics and all that stuff. No, like I am going to do everything in my power. So I've lost like 35 pounds and I've cut out carbs and a ton of sugar. And, you know, so I'm actively making shifts and changes in my life so that these burdens don't continue to pass on. And that's why that pruning process is so important. It's not just staring at the tree and going, yeah, I don't want to plant that in my child's life. Okay, next. Like, no, you actually have to do something.
What I love about this is just you're doing it in a very shame-free way. Yes. And what I talk about is being like a kind observer of ourselves, but then you're also being a kind observer of your past. So what I'm hearing from you is like, yeah, well, this happened when I was younger and not bringing shame there. Because I know when I work with clients, they they have this reluctance to look because they're like, well, I don't want to beat my mom up. And it's like, you're not. That was your mom of, that was what she was doing at that point. And that's she, you only know you only do what you can know and whatever. And it's like, now that we know better, we do better.
So true. And
Really,
I was, oh, go ahead.
that peacefulness and kindness to it.
Yes. And I went through that. Because I was raised in a home where you said what happens in this house stays in this house.
Yeah.
And if you go out and you start talking about the family dirt, you're betraying the family.
Mm-hmm.
You do not do that. And not only is that wrong, but you will get shamed for it. If not by people in the house, extended family members, like, no, I don't believe, and so even when I started talking about these things, there was this anxiety. I remember when because I have a pretty extensive About Me page where I talk more about my history and things that I went through. And I remember after I posted it, I went and I visited my mother and I said, there's something I want you to read. And I tried to be all casual, but I know I was awkward and sweaty and gross. Yes. And I was like, and she's like, okay, what is it? And I had it pulled up on my phone. And I didn't mean to, but I literally threw the phone at her and like ran out of the room. I was like, and gone. Like, I was like, what was that? It was like a 10-year-old just like took over my body and like throwing the report card and running. Like,
oh yeah. Yeah, we do what we can do. I love it.
Exactly. But it was interesting because her reaction was, wow, I didn't realize you went through all of that. She actually didn't say much about the parenting piece at all.
Okay.
And then after that, I ended up sitting down with, she and my sister came to visit me and we all sat down and I recorded us talking about how things were growing up so we actually made a video of us having conversations about what are the commonalities and the differences about how we grew up and why we think we are the way that we are. So it actually turned into a very beautiful thing.
Beautiful is the word I was like, oh, how beautiful. And this speaks to your using our past and our experiences sort of as a schoolhouse and learning about it. Like your mom was obviously able to, how fortunate to shift into that, not defensive, but more curious. Like, oh, this is interesting that my daughter had this experience. Let me, and learn from it. Wow.
Exactly. And, now I say, like my grandmother, she was a huge, huge, beautiful, amazing, powerful force in my life. And if I can even have half of her qualities, I'll consider this a job well done in my life. And she was one of the people who was like, happens in this house stays in this house, and she was absolutely the matriarch in every sense of the word. And she's since passed on, but I think it's important for people to know, because I thought about her too, like, am I dishonoring her? And no, because I can speak about all the wonderful, amazing, beautiful qualities. And I know she loved me fiercely, right? So it's not about reverse shaming, but if we don't talk about it, then we can't transform it. No. Right? It's like you have to pull something. You can't try to fix a car in the dark. You can't do it, people. I don't care how good you are at it. You got to shed some light on that engine in order to really be able to change the spark plugs and the oil and all that stuff, or you're just going to hurt yourself and have a big mess, right? So it's that same thing. It's like you got to pull it out into the light and do it with love, do it with kindness, and realizing like I don't begrudge. I'm not angry. And I think that's another point. I promise I'm going to finish the sentence because I realized I started like 5 sentences. I think the other piece that makes a difference for me too is I have healed a lot of that. So when I talk about it, I'm physically not angry. I'm not overwhelmed with grief and all of that stuff. And I would say to people, if you are still in that place, because I was there, for different members of my family, maybe be clear and careful about where you share it. Like, share it in safe spaces with safe people. You may not want to hop on a radio show if you still have a whole lot of anger inside of you and start talking about your family, because in that case, it might come across as bashing. Not that you don't have every right, but
through it. Yeah.
If you're trying to avoid that,
Well, and someone said, it might have been Brene Brown, or it might have, I don't know, but someone
she says everything. Her and Oprah, that's like, they're like the keepers of knowledge for everyone.
but it was like, share your wound after it's scabbed over. Like,
Oh yeah.
still, you sort of like, it can still be like this, oh yeah, okay, I wish that had been done differently, or, you know, the trauma you were speaking of, it's like, yeah, that was hurtful and harmful, but to not still have that, like, ooze, that just always has been a very good example for me as I've moved through my life. Like, is this still this like
Is
raw,
it tender?
yeah, pain
Yes.
I need to do my own work on? And then that's when you work with a therapist or a coach. And then
Exactly.
secondarily, to then share with those who've earned the right to hear your story.
Exactly. That's a big thing in the therapy world. Like I've done a lot of, one of my specializations when I was doing therapy, now I'm doing family coaching, but when I was doing therapy was trauma healing. So I did trauma healing stuff for over 15 years. And somebody would say, like, should I confront my abuser? Should I tell my, you know, all of these, we'd have those conversations. And I would say, you know, you're ready when their response no longer matters.
I love that.
That's when you're ready.
I love that. And that's so hard to understand when you're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But it's just that, like, you can forgive people. Like, I have had some experiences in my life and I've forgiven them and I haven't even talked to them. You know,
Yeah.
I just shine love. I'm like, and that is such a great reminder that, yeah, I don't care what they say back. That's when.
Exactly. That's when you're ready. And at that point, you probably won't want to do it anymore.
Right. Well, I love that. And that does talk about this healing and this, you know, so much of your work is this, like, becoming an observer of your own mind and looking with curiosity instead of defensiveness about, like, oh, what is this reaction teaching me? Or what is this sort of experience teaching me?
Exactly. That's really, really huge. I am a firm believer. And I always say, you know, deep, like I have jokingly say, like, individual growth is a myth. It's not a thing. Like, all deep, meaningful, lasting growth occurs in relationship. In order to grow, we have to have something to bang up against. And or there's no impetus. If I was just raised in a vacuum in like a sensory deprivation chamber where I didn't feel anything, I wouldn't grow. If anything, I'd shrivel up, you know? But relationships, and relationship could be with anything. It could be with a person, it could be with nature, it could be with an illness, you know, but those things give us something to bump up against. And when we realize everything that comes into our life gives us an opportunity to grow. Everything that comes into our life, every relationship, every illness, everything brings with it a syllabus. And we can choose or not choose to engage in that class at that time. You know, we keep trying to run and drop, add, period, you know, and all that other stuff.
Required learning. Yeah. Like, you got to go
right.
Yeah.
But the thing about drop, add, period is, it's funny, if you think about college, you know, or the beginning of the semester where you could drop the class or add a new class, is if it's a core class, at some point you have to take it. You have to learn the lessons that it contains. So you can drop all you want, but at some point, if it holds a deep, meaningful lesson that you really need to learn, you're gonna have to learn it one way or another.
Well, this is a great time for you to explain a little what you talk about when you speak of a fixed mindset marriage.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So the fixed mindset marriages are, and this comes from Carol Dweck's work, kind of adopted it. You know, she talks about fixed mindsets versus growth mindset around learning. And in terms of when it's used, when she uses it with children, it's this idea of children who have a fixed mindset believe that I'm either smart or I'm not. Right? So I either know everything or I don't. So those children often take less risks. They do fewer things, like they keep themselves in their bubble, because if they fail or they make a mistake or they fumble, they take that and internalize that as a core flaw or a sign that this just isn't workable, right? I'm not workable. I can't do things. Whereas a growth mindset, if you have a child with a growth mindset, they look kind of like we're talking about. They look at things as a lesson. Like I say, all life is an experiment, right? So you can't fail an experiment. It's not really a thing. You learn from it. You do it, you see what happens, and then you run it again, right? And that's more of that growth mindset perspective. It's, that didn't work. Let me try this. Well, what about this? And so when I apply that to marriages, I look at it from the perspective of, does this couple have a fixed or a growth mindset? And a fixed mindset says, um, this is broken or it's fixed. There's no in between, you know, and it's just how it is, you know, versus the growth mindset is more of, okay, things aren't going well, or it might really feel broken right now, but there's room to move,
Okay.
you know. And I also look at it as sort of like like a light switch. You know, you have the light switches, there's either the on off or you can have the dimmer switch. So fixed mindset couples often look at marriage like the on-off switch. You flip it on off. So I'm either stable misery or what I like to call the opposite of stable misery, dynamic joy. Like either in stable misery or joy. That's it. Those are the only two options, right? Whereas the growth mindset marriage, you look at that more as like a dimmer switch. So at any given point, I can be stable, core stable misery, or I can be in joy, or anywhere in between. Right? And if I'm in stable misery, if I have a growth mindset, then I'm not trying to get to joy tomorrow. What I'm asking myself is, what is one thing I can do or we can do in this moment to bring ourselves one step closer to joy? What is one thing we can do to raise the volume of the light in our relationship just a little bit right now? Right? And allow that to be enough.
Well, and that brings to mind the experiments too. Like, let's experiment. And that's more the growth mindset than fix. Like, if we try it, then it doesn't work. Then, oh my God, we stink. Versus like, well, let's try it. Let's, have a little dance party. And then, okay, well, that didn't work. Or, that did lighten the mood. Or, wow, you're even more pissed. So,
don't do that again.
But the idea of experimenting to move towards that dynamic joy, that's exciting. And you speak of tools, which is so, I love how you speak of tools. So I work with clients and I'm like, let's learn new tools. But your idea that we're always using a tool.
Oh, yeah.
Could you speak to that a little?
Absolutely. So part of the framework that I created is I talk about tools. And the thing I say that it's never a question of, am I using a tool or am I not? The question is the tool I'm using helpful or unhelpful? Because taking a deep breath when you're angry, that's a tool. Yelling when you're angry, that is also a tool, right? They're both tools. It's just one is likely going to be a little bit more helpful than the other, just a little bit.
Oh, I love it. It's just, and it is, again, it's that like learning and schoolhouse mindset, that kind of mindset of like, okay, how's this tool working for me? Let me maybe choose a different tool to use.
Exactly. And that's the beautiful thing. Tools are not attached to us. We can put them down and pick them up and trade them out anytime that we want to. Right. Yeah. So going back to what we talked about earlier with the legacy burden, when you were saying like, oh, I'm a yeller, I come from a lineage of yellers. That is not true. You come from a lineage of people who have used yelling, the tool of yelling, quite often. And at any given point in time, you can choose to put that tool down and pick up another one. Right? You don't have to continue to use that same tool. So for me, that tool mindset also just gives another perspective on the fact that, like my high blood pressure, I'm sure it's serving. I know it does. My body is actually doing what it needs to do in response to, right? Exactly. High blood pressure isn't the devil. It's just, it's just what it is. Well, okay, I won't go there. But, it's... But, it's one of those things where it's like, it's something that my body is doing. It's a tool that my body is using in order to reach a certain level of equilibrium. That's it. And so I need to teach my body to use a different tool. And in order to do that, there's some things I have to remove. And there's a reason why it's using that as a tool, right? So realizing that we have more power, and that's another piece of the framework, empowerment. I talk about stable misery minions, things that really help stable misery to thrive. And one of them is powerlessness. It's when we feel powerless to do anything, we're way more likely to slip right back into those old habits that are just familiar to us and that make sense to us.
Well, you just described how I felt in the years of therapy I did with my first husband, which that marriage now ended, but this sort of powerless and I guess that brings up the question, when you were in a therapeutic relationship with a couple, are there certain signs or deal breakers like that their relationship won't work, or things that you see as like, oh wow, okay, this is interesting? Or are you like, no, all relationships we can move you out of this?
All relationships are fixable. That's a good question. I would say, looking at all the couples I've worked with, the biggest indicator to me of whether or not that, the relationship is going to thrive, two things actually. One of them is how committed they are to making it work. Like I've literally had, and now there's some issues that I just don't work with now because it's, as coaching, it's not appropriate. But there were times where a couple would come into my office and one person in the couple, their agenda was to break up with the other one. Of course, the other one didn't know this, right? So I've literally had people come into my office to break up, and so.
That's right, yeah.
But if both people are committed and are like, this is a crap show, but we are committed to making it work, then yeah, I think just about anything can go, because at that point, both people are willing to shift and change and do the work. The other thing, go ahead.
They're not in a fixed mindset. They're in that growth mindset.
Yes, exactly.
We learn if they're coming to you and committed. That's beautiful.
Absolutely. And the second thing that I've learned anecdotally just from working with couples, the difference I see in couples that sort of slingshot through our work together versus the ones that still go, but they might be on foot. They might not take the slingshot. Positive intention, assumption of positive intention is huge. Couples that assume that the other person's intention is good in what they say and what they do, they're gonna slingshot, versus couples who are assuming, so the stories in their head are, she's doing that just to make me mad, or he thinks this about me, and there's this almost this battlefield, where this line is drawn and they're looking for things. So the assumption of positive intention or lack thereof is also an indicator, not necessarily of whether or not a marriage would make it, but just in terms of how quickly we move through.
Schoolhouse, right?
Yes.
Well, yeah, and then we look for what we, our brain finds evidence for what we look for. So if we're looking for, we're like, oh yeah, well, he meant well by this. We're going to look for evidence of that. But if we're like, no, he is out to get me, well,
yeah,
look for that.
Exactly. And in some cases that might be true. When we get into those really mean places, I say your wife's no longer your wife, or your husband's no longer your husband. Now they're the enemy. And that is a really tough place, because that's when your fight, flight, freeze brain kicks in, and now you're protecting yourself. And it may not be an actual physically or emotionally abusive space, but I would say the brain can't tell the difference between the tiger in the dream and the tiger in reality. A tiger is a tiger to your brain, right? So if there is a perception that this person is trying to undermine me, manipulate me, be mean to me, all this stuff, then that's what's happening. And you're going to respond and react as if that's what's going on, and sometimes that is what's going on, because what we end up doing, we end up sort of volleyballing. So you hurt me, hurt people, right? So you hurt me, so now I'm gonna hurt you, and then I hurt you, so now you're gonna hurt me, and so we just go back and forth, and we get caught into these cycles, which propel us just further into stable misery.
Which leads me, I'm going to be conscious of your time, and I'm so grateful that you came today, but this is one of the questions I had, and when you're speaking of tools and sort of moving up that ladder, not the light switch, but the sort of dimmer switch from stable misery to more dynamic joy, and choosing, one thing better or one thing differently, or, instead of this volleyball back and forth, well, he didn't, do this. It's like, okay, no, maybe I will, trying something different. My audience loves homework and loves doing things. Are there any tips or tools or small steps you would recommend if they are thinking that they're in stable misery in their marriage to start moving themselves out?
Absolutely. So I have a download of a roadmap. It's called, and you can get it off healingsstablemisery.com. And on that roadmap, it lays out each of the steps, each of the paths. There's 5 paths
Yep.
that you can take. And it actually spells out paths, PATHS. And on that roadmap, it gives you something that you can do in every single one of those steps, small steps you can take. And I tell people, when you do that, download it, read it, just do one. Okay, overachiever perfectionists like me out there, don't go in there reading it, trying to do all 15 things. Don't set yourself up. Just pick one that resonates with you the most, that you feel like, oh, I'm actually excited to try this, right? And then try it for a week with your kid or your partner. The way the roadmap is laid out, I've written it where you can use it in your parenting or your partnership. So if you find that you're in stable misery in either one of those, you can use the tools and the tips on that roadmap to help you break free and shift how you're showing up in those relationships.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That is wonderful. And is there anything that you're working on right now that you're excited about, or especially?
I actually am in the process of launching a program called Triggered to Transformed. It's a 6-week, I call it a revolutionizing parenting experience. It's not a course. And the thing that I'm really excited about this is, a lot of times when you do a course, you get all these modules and then you're supposed to apply it to the 50 million things that are happening with your kids. And then you might walk away with 2 nuggets because our brains are not structured to hold all that information, which is also why we can't remember things out of books that we read and stuff like that in the moment, because when we're triggered, the part of our brain that holds that information is shut down. That's our frontal lobe. We have no access to it. So what I've done is I've created a program where we take a few triggers, like maybe 1 or 2 of your most intense triggers, and we work through the 6 weeks on those. And then while you're doing that, you actually literally create a map, because I like roads and paths and stuff. So you're literally going to create a map that you can return to again and again to help you remember how you got where you are by the end of the program.
I love that.
Right.
When does that launch?
So I'm in the launch period right now. I'm not sure when this is going to air, but it's definitely something that I'm going to launch again.
Okay, so we will
Yes.
get them over to your website. I will have all links to the Stable Misery Roadmap and the you just have tremendous resources on your website, and your Instagram, all of that I will put on the website. And Warriors, I encourage you to go over and support her as she supports you, because you really are just such a giver. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I will say, the program, it starts in August.
Okay.
So if this airs before that, if people want to reach out to me if they're interested, and we'll see if we can.
Yeah, I will. That's awesome. So the show is called the Love Your Life Show. And is there anything that you do every day to set yourself up to live a life that you love?
That's such a good question. One thing I do, I used to go outside every day. I don't know if I've done that every day since the pandemic has started, but I do take time to stop and look outside and really just admire nature and be with nature, because when I'm in nature, I feel so present. Right. So if I'm in here, I'm looking outside right now, and I'm looking at the trees, and no matter where I am emotionally or mentally, when I look at the trees, when I look at the clouds, when I watch the trees move in the wind, it just brings me back to the present moment in such a peaceful and kind way. So that's something that I'm really big on, because my mind can go in 15 different directions. So that's a really good grounding exercise.
Well, and I love that. And let's try that today, Warriors. Let's go out there and live lives that we love, and take some time to just look out and look at the trees and the clouds and the non-clouds, or whatever it is that you do. Thank you, Dr. Lynyetta Willis, for joining us today. I am grateful.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.